I'm going to read Draft Board Nights, Chapter 9 of My Life and Hard Times by James Thurber. James Grover Thurber was born 1894 and died 1961. My Life and Hard Times was first published in 1933. This material is okay to be listened to by children. Draft Board Nights. I left the university in June 1918, but I couldn't get into the Army on account of my sight, just as grandfather couldn't get in on account of his age. He applied several times, and each time he took off his coat and threatened to whip the men who said he was too old. The disappointment of not getting to Germany, he saw no sense in everybody going to France, and the strain of running around town seeing influential officials finally got him down in bed. He had wanted to lead a division, and his chagrin at not even being able to enlist as a private was too much for him. His brother, Jake, some 15 years younger than he was, sat up at night with him after he took to bed, because we were afraid he might leave the house without putting on his clothes. Grandfather was against the idea of Jake watching over him. He thought it was a lot of tomfoolery. But Jake hadn't been able to sleep at night for 28 years, so he was the perfect person for such a vigil. On the third night, Grandfather was wakeful. He would open his eyes, look at Jake, and close them again, frowning. He never answered any question Jake asked him. About 4 o'clock that morning, he caught his brother sound asleep in the big leather chair beside the bed. When once Jake did fall asleep, he slept deeply, so that Grandfather was able to get up, dress himself, undress Jake, and put him in bed without waking him. When my Aunt Florence came in the room at 7 o'clock, Grandfather was sitting in the chair reading the Memoirs of U.S. Grant, and Jake was sleeping in the bed. "He watched while I slept," said Grandfather, "so now I'm watching while he sleeps." It seemed fair enough. One reason we didn't want Grandfather to roam around at night was that he had said something once or twice about going over to Lancaster, his old hometown, and putting his problem up to Kump. That is, General William Tecumseh Sherman, also an old Lancaster boy. We knew that his inability to find Sherman would be bad for him, and we were afraid that he might try to get there in the little electric runabout that had been bought for my grandmother. She had become, surprisingly enough, quite skillful at getting around town in it. Grandfather was astonished and a little indignant when he saw her get into the contraption and drive off smoothly and easily. It was her first vehicular triumph over him in almost 50 years of married life, and he determined to learn to drive the thing himself. A famous old horseman, he approached it as he might have approached a wild colt. His brow would darken, and he would begin to curse. He always leaped into it quickly, as if it might pull out from under him if he didn't get into the seat fast enough. The first few times he tried to run the electric, he went swiftly around in a small circle, drove over a curb, across the sidewalk, and up onto the lawn. We all tried to persuade him to give up, but his spirit was aroused. "Get that goddamn buggy back in the road," he would say imperiously. So he would maneuver it back onto the street, and he would try again. Pulling too savagely on the guiding bar, to teach the electric a lesson, was what took him around in a circle, and it was difficult to make him understand that it was best to relax and not get mad. He had the notion that if you didn't hold her, she would throw you. And a man who, or so he often told us, had driven a 4-horse McCormick Reaper when he was 5 years old did not intend to be thrown by an electric runabout. Since there was no way of getting him to give up learning to operate the electric, we would take him out to Franklin Park, where the roadways were wide and unfrequented, and spend an hour or so trying to explain the differences between driving a horse and carriage and driving an electric. He would keep muttering all the time. He never got it out of his head that when he took the driver's seat, the machine flattened its ears on him, so to speak. After a few weeks, nevertheless, he got so he could run the electric for 100 yards or so along a fairly straight line. But whenever he took a curve, he invariably pulled or pushed the bar too quickly and too hard and headed for a tree or a flower bed. Someone was always with him, and we would never let him take the car out of the park. One morning, when grandmother was all ready to go to market, she called the garage and told them to send the electric around. They said that grandfather had already been there and taken it out. There was a tremendous to-do. We telephoned to Uncle Will, and he got out his lawsier, and we started off to hunt for grandfather. It was not yet 7 o'clock, and there was fortunately little traffic. We headed for Franklin Park, figuring that he might have gone out there to try to break the car's spirit. One or two pedestrians had seen a tall old gentleman with a white beard driving a little electric and cussing as he drove. We followed a tortuous trail and found them finally on Nelson Road, about 4 miles from the town of Shepherd. Grandfather was standing in the road shouting, and the back wheels of the electric were deeply entangled in a barbed wire fence. 2 workmen and a farmhand were trying to get the thing loose. Grandfather was standing in the road shouting, and the back wheels of the electric were deeply entangled in a barbed wire fence. 2 workmen and a farmhand were trying to get the thing loose. Grandfather was in a state of high wrath about the electric. The blank backed up on me, he told us. But to get back to the war, the Columbus Draft Board never called grandfather for service, which was a lucky thing for them because they would have had to take him. There were stories that several old men of 80 or 90 had been summoned in the confusion, but somehow or other grandfather was missed. He waited every day for the call, but it never came. My own experience was quite different. I was called out every week, even though I had been exempted from the service the first time I went before the medical examiners. Either they were never convinced that it was me, or else there was some clerical error in the records, which was never cleared up. Anyway, there was usually a letter for me on Monday ordering me to report for examination on the 2nd floor of Memorial Hall the following Wednesday at 9 p.m. The second time I went up, I tried to explain to one of the doctors that I had already been exempted. "You're just a blur to me," I said, taking off my glasses. "You're absolutely nothing to me," he snapped sharply. I had to take off all my clothes each time and jog around the hall with a lot of porters and bank presidents' sons and clerks and poets. Our hearts and lungs would be examined, and then our feet, and finally our eyes. That always came last. When the eye specialist got around to me, he would always say, "Why, you couldn't get into the service with sight like that." "I know," I would say. Then, a week or 2 later, I would be summoned again and go through the same rigmarole. The 9th or 10th time I was called, I happened to pick up one of several stethoscopes that were lying on a table, and suddenly, instead of finding myself in the line of draftmen, I found myself in the line of examiners. "Hello, doctor," said one of them, nodding. "Hello," I said. That, of course, was before I took my clothes off. I might have managed it naked, but I doubt it. I was assigned, or rather drifted, to the chest and lung section, where I began to examine every other man, thus cutting old Dr. Ridgway's work in 2. "I'm glad to have you here, doctor," he said. I passed most of the men that came to me, but now and then I would exempt one just to be on the safe side. I began by making each of them hold his breath and then say, Me, until I noticed Ridgway looking at me curiously. He, I discovered, simply made them say, ah, and sometimes he didn't make them say anything. Once I got a hold of a man who, it came out later, had swallowed a watch, to make the doctors believe there was something wrong with him inside. It was a common subterfuge. Men swallowed nails, hairpins, ink, etc., in an effort to be let out. Since I didn't know what you were supposed to hear through a stethoscope, the ticking of the watch at first didn't surprise me, but I decided to call Dr. Ridgway into consultation, because nobody else had ticked. "This man seems to tick," I said to him. He looked at me in surprise, but didn't say anything. Then he thumped the man, laid his ear to his chest, and finally tried the stethoscope. "Sound as $1, he said. "Listen down lower," I told him. The man indicated his stomach. Ridgway gave him a haughty, indignant look. "That is for the abdominal men to worry about," he said, and moved off. A few minutes later, Dr. Blythe Bellamy got around to the man and listened, but he didn't blink an eye. His grim expression never changed. "You have swallowed a watch, my man," he said, crisply. The draftee reddened in embarrassment and uncertainty. "On purpose?" he asked. "That I can't say," the doctor told him, and went on. I served with the draft board for about 4 months. Until the summons ceased, I couldn't leave town, and as long as I stayed and appeared promptly for examination, even though I did the examining, I felt that technically I could not be convicted of evasion. During the daytime, I worked as publicity agent for an amusement park, the manager of which was a tall, unexpected young man named Byron Landis. Some years before, he had dynamited the men's lounge in the State House Annex for a prank. He enjoyed pouring buckets of water on sleeping persons, and once he had barely escaped arrest for jumping off the top of the old Columbus Transfer Company building with a homemade parachute. He asked me one morning if I would like to take a ride in the new Scarlet Tornado, a steep and wavy roller coaster. I didn't want to, but I was afraid he would think I was afraid, so I went along. It was about 10 o'clock, and there was nobody at the park except workmen and attendants and concessionaires in their shirt sleeves. We climbed into one of the long gondolas of the roller coaster, and while I was looking around for the man who was going to run it, we began to move off. Landis, I discovered, was running it himself. But it was too late to get out. We had begun to climb, clickety-clockety, up the first steep incline, down the other side of which we careened at 80 miles an hour. "I didn't know you could run this thing," I bawled at my companion as we catapulted up a 60-degree arch and looped along into space. "I didn't either," he bawled back. The racket and the rush of air were terrific as we roared into the pitch-black cave of darkness and came out and down Monahan's Leap, so called because a workman named Monahan had been forced to jump from it when caught between two approaching experimental cars while it was being completed. That trip, although it ended safely, made a lasting impression on me. It is not too much to say that it has flavored my life. It is the reason I shout in my sleep, refuse to ride on the elevated, keep jerking the emergency brake in cars other people are driving, have the sensation of flying like a bird when I first lie down, and in certain months can't keep anything in my stomach. During my last few trips down to the draft board, I went again as a draft prospect, having grown tired of being an examiner. None of the doctors who had been my colleagues for so long recognized me, not even Dr. Ridgway. When he examined my chest for the last time, I asked him if there hadn't been another doctor helping him. He said there had been. "Did he look anything like me?" I asked. Dr. Ridgway looked at me. I don't think so, he said. He was taller. I had my shoes off while he was examining me. A good pulmonary man, said Ridgway. Relative of yours? I said yes. He sent me on to Dr. Quimby, the specialist who had examined my eyes 12 or 15 times before. He gave me the same simple reading tests. You can never get into the army with eyes like that, he said. I know, I told him. Late one morning, shortly after my last examination, I was awakened by the sound of bells ringing and whistles blowing. It grew louder and more insistent and wilder. It was the armistice.